So hello. Can everybody hear me? Can I get a yes? Thanks you.
Yes.
Um, so welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center, and we are continuing today to read Hannah Arendt's last unfinished book, The Life of the Mind. We're reading volume one, which is called Thinking, and volume one has a number of parts to it, namely four parts. And the first part is called Appearance, and we are going to finish up that discussion of part one of volume one on appearance today. So we're reading chapters 6, 7, and 8. Chapter 6 is the thinking ego and the self. Kant. Chapter 7 is reality and the thinking ego, the Cartesian doubt and sensus communis. And then chapter 8 is on science and common sense, and returning to Kant's distinction between intellect and reason, truth and meaning. And it's not an accident that this first chapter in the book Thinking, which is on appearance, ends with chapter 8, which is on truth versus meaning. That is really the theme here of what Arendt is after. She says that the whole book on thinking is an attempt to understand the activity of thinking. What is this activity of thinking? Well, she says it's not necessarily a philosophical question. It is a question about what is thinking. What are we doing when we think? And she says that the guiding thread, according to which she will pursue this question, is the distinction between intellect and reason. In Kant's terminology, Verstand, understanding or intellect, and Vernunft, reason. And whereas intellect or cognition or Verstand seeks to know things and get the truth of them, reason or Vernunft or thinking doesn't pursue truth, it pursues meaning. And she says the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And this is really the claim that she makes that you most have to try and understand if you're going to make sense of the whole book, and certainly this first part of the book, which is setting it up. So with that in mind, I think we should somewhat jump right in, just to remind ourselves that the chapter 5, which was the last chapter we read for last time, was on appearance and semblance, and she begins to develop this idea of authentic and inauthentic semblances, which is going to be an interesting and important idea that she carries through in chapter 6 and 7. But the basic idea is that there are semblances, namely things that are not real, that even though they're not real, are part of what it means to be human. And that they are not, therefore, semblances that can simply be disproven and excised from human thinking. We actually have to deal with them. She says in chapter 5, authentic semblances are unavoidable and inherent in the world of appearances. And this is a great argument against scientific positivism, right? So there are certain semblances which, even though they're not scientifically provable and they're not real, they are inherent and important in the world of appearances. So now as we move to chapter 6, Thinking, Ego, and the Self, Kant, she says that when Kant develops his idea of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, and so for those of you who don't know your Immanuel Kant, Kant says that the only things human beings can know are objects of experience, namely things we experience in our heads, through intuition, through senses. We can't know anything in itself. So when I see you, looking at me through the computer, I don't see you in yourself. I see an appearance of you. I see an intuition of you, and it's an object of experience, and that's all I can know. I can't know what's behind the object of appearance. I can only know that it's there. And Kant says that there are there's appearances and objects in themselves, and he then calls appearances mere appearances, which Arendt says she says there's no problem with the distinction between thing in itself and appearance. The problem is when you say mere appearance, you create this hierarchy in which the thing in itself is more true or more important than the appearance. And as you know from reading about Portman's work and her use of Adolf Portman's work, she wants to reverse or at least challenge this hierarchy that puts being over appearance. And she wants to say, actually, it may be that appearance is more important than being. So Kant actually thinks of and first discovers the thing in itself, being, as opposed to appearance, in the experience of thinking. So this is relevant to our inquiry into what is the activity of thinking. Kant says that in the experience of thinking, in the activity of thinking, I think. And in thinking, I am conscious of myself. Now, you all know that René Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, or I think I am. Kant doesn't say exactly the same thing. He says, I think, and I'm conscious of myself. And in this consciousness of myself, in this sheer activity of thinking, what I am is the thing itself. Although I never see that thing itself, or actually touch it, or feel it in any sensible way. But I think about it, and I think I am a self, and I think there must be some self behind myself. There must be something there. And the thoughts I have when I'm thinking can't just come out of nowhere. They can't be arbitrary, I think. They must come from my thinking ego, my thing, it's myself. And this thinking ego must be something. And so he says, even though we can't sense this thinking ego, even though it's invisible and non-sensible, we have a non-sensible feeling that it exists. Now that's a mouthful to some degree, but this is an important idea in Kant, and it comes up in a lot of his work, non-sensible feelings, especially in his moral and political philosophy, when he'll say that freedom is a non-sensible feeling as well. In any case, Kant says that we have this non-sensible feeling that I have a thinking ego. And this thinking ego is not the same as myself that exists in the apparent world. It's the source of my thinking. It's the Ding an sich. And so this creates a metaphysical fallacy that Kant himself recognized. The fallacy is simple. It's that, on the one hand, I'm aware that I have this non-sensible thinking ego, and yet I'm also aware that this non-sensible thinking ego, I can't ever prove that it exists. It's a logical fallacy. And she says the Oxford philosophers, by which she means the analytic philosophers, will say, oh, all these metaphysical thinkers like Kant and Hegel were so stupid, they didn't understand it was a logical fallacy. She says, no, they understood it, but what they understood also is that this thinking ego, even though it can't be proven, and even though it's not real in the sense that we can know it, is what she calls an authentic semblance. It's caused by, as I said before, the inherent paradoxes of human living as an appearing and thinking being. On the one hand, we appear, but on the other hand, we have this experience of thinking. And in thinking, we withdraw from the world. And in withdrawing from the world, we imagine ourselves, we feel that we have a thinking ego. And everyone has this feeling, she says. It's not just me. All of you have it. And insofar as we all have this feeling of ourselves as a thinking ego, it is authentic. It is an inherent paradox of being a human being and living in a world. So that's the basics, I think, of what she's trying to say in chapter 6. I'll do chapter 7, and then we'll stop there for a second before we move to chapter 8 and take some questions. Chapter 7 is reality and the thinking ego, the Cartesian doubt, and the sensus communis. Sensus communis is this common sense, which she's going to call the sixth sense. So we have our 5 senses that we all know of. And she says the common sense is what fits them all together. And it's what fits us into the apparent world. It's the sense we all have in common. So the problem is that, again, there's this paradox in which all of us not only have common sense and not only exist in the apparent world, but also know how to think. And insofar as we know how to think, we know how to withdraw from that world of appearances and imagine ourselves as a thinking ego, separate from that world of experiences, a disembodied, purely thinking being. Now, philosophers maybe do this better or more often, more perceptively or strongly than some of us do, but all of us can have this sense of a thinking ego. And the thinking ego makes us doubt the common world. It's part of what she calls a solipsism, a solipsistic theory that sees man as singular. And she says all philosophers and all people, insofar as they are thinking, in the activity of thinking, see man as this thinking being, in Descartes' language, a pure mind, separate from body. So Descartes creates this dualism, that on the one hand there's thinking, and on the other hand there's body. And he says they're separate. And his question is, how do they interact? Well, even if we don't accept pure Cartesian dualism, the question is, we all have this sense of us as a thinking being, which doesn't exist, Arendt says. It's a fictitious idea, because there is no disembodied mind or thinking being. It's an assemblance, as we've said. It withdraws from what she calls the beastliness of the multitude into the absolute solitude of the one, on page 47. And Descartes is the example of this truly radical solipsism. And she says it's a response to the glories of science. And it's important for us to at least understand what she means by this, because this is part of her approach to science, which is going to continue to come up over and again during the book. What science does, insofar as science is a kind of thinking, is it challenges what we know. It challenges the appearance. It looks, so we see the sun rise, and science says, is that really what's happening? Or is it the sun is there and we're moving around the sun on the earth? So science leads to doubt. And it is out of this glory of science, which teaches us that we can pierce common sense and show it to be an illusion, an semblance, or an appearance, and therefore seek to disillusion ourselves. It is this glory of science that leads us to reject appearances and reject common sense, and thus the apparent world. So she cites Wittgenstein on page 49, who is the ultimate solipsistic thinker at one point, and she says that at death the world does not alter, but comes to an end. All, and that's a fundamental claim of solipsism, namely that when I die, the world doesn't continue after me, simply altered, namely without me as a living being. The world ends because everything in the world is part of my thinking ego, and that's the fallacy of the thinking ego. And Arendt says there is no such thing. But, namely, she says, this thinking ego is still a meaningful and authentic semblance. All right. Let me stop there, having quickly gone through chapters 6 and 7. I realize they're a little complicated because they're dealing with Kant and Descartes. But let's see if we have questions or thoughts or things we want to discuss on those two before we go on to chapter 8, which is the culminating chapter of this section. So are there questions that immediately pop up? Should I go to the... I see Jack said he's following the notes. Yeah, Daphne gives him a good advice. This book is 2 volumes, Thinking and Willing. So if you want to find the notes to Thinking, you have to look at the end of volume 1, which starts on page 217 and goes chapter by chapter. Okay? Jack writes, invisible as it may be, speculation is a real activity of human beings, and to the extent that it leads to beliefs, it can have direct bearing on sense experience. That's true. So one of the things she's going to say in chapter 8 is that science itself, as a speculative activity, as a thinking activity, is still connected to common sense and to the world. It's driven by evidence, and it's driven by a desire for truth, but it always pushes beyond that. So I don't know, Jack, you want to rephrase that or move on? Or anyone else?
No, I don't want to take a lot of time on this because to a great extent, the summary that you just gave speaks to that. There's a conclusion that she does not come to at all. And I don't know whether this occurs later in the book or not, but she speaks of the senses as the all 6 senses, if you want to accept the idea of a 6th sense, as the way in which we validate reality in the world. But the ideas that arise through thinking can actually impact the way people sense things. So you may see things that are not there. You may hear things that are not that don't exist and believe them to exist and use them as evidence for other ideas. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the speculative capability can lead to a distorted, or maybe even distorted isn't really the right word because we all have to agree on what we see, right? But a different image of the real world than the senses supposedly give us. I don't know that I can make that clear, but that's the way I'm thinking. I'm thinking about the impact of the ability to speculate on the experience of the senses.
Yes, I mean I think that's clear, and one of the insights that Arendt hammers again and again, not only in this book but in The Human Condition and in a number of her essays that address the question of science, is that science brings us both incredible pride in our human ability to know and understand and, let's be honest, manipulate our world, right? I mean, the ability to build dams, to recreate rivers, to make new atoms or make new cells, and potentially the ability to genetically reproduce or genetically alter and genetically grow human beings, right? These are all things that science promises, and she says gives human beings incredible pride and confidence in their ability to impact and remake the world. And so, yeah, science changes the world. And I mean, this is one of the more esoteric things or more difficult things to understand in her writing, and it's hasn't been fully understood by very many people. But the idea that the only true actors, she says, in the scientific age are scientists, those who put new processes into motion. So if you split an atom, suddenly the whole world is going to change because you've created new things which will now have an impact for, ad infinitum. And the old Byron quote that poets are the creators of the world. For Arendt, in the scientific age, it's largely scientists, because scientists can act into the world and remake the world. So on the one hand, there's this pride. On the other hand, there's a deep despair, because once we can show that the world is not what we know it to be, and that the world as we see it and as it appears to us is not the world as it really is, we despair of ever being at home in the world. We no longer trust our senses. If you really understand science, you know that so much of what you daily do and daily see and daily think is based on an illusion or an semblance, an authentic semblance maybe, but still a semblance. And so we start to distrust our senses. In a very strong passage in The Human Condition, she says science is a rape upon our senses. And thus we are alienated from the world we live in because we don't trust it. We no longer feel at home in it. And this is the source of the deep alienation and loneliness that Arendt spends much of her life exploring and investigating in its political consequences. Yes, in our scientific and knowledge pursuing aims, we change the world, we remake the world, we alienate ourselves from the world. All of this is true and happens. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were saying, Jack. I mean, maybe I misunderstood it, but that's what it made me try to want to say and think about. Is that
actually it does? It actually respond to my comment in Arendtian terms, and I'm very clear on that, and so that leads me to other conclusions I don't want to spend time on right now about other ideas that she has put forward, but I have a Weltanschauung that's slightly different, and it's just ever so sufficiently different so that I feel that it's different, although it isn't all that far. All right, and I don't want to take the time with laying my world picture on other people, but I think you were very clear in the implications of what I said in Arendt's work, which I think is very good and useful. Thank you.
Okay. Do you still have a question about the footnotes? I mean,
yeah. Well, I don't want to take time on this session for it, but maybe afterward, maybe somebody can explain to me why there doesn't seem to be a correspondence between some footnotes and what it is. It's just I'm just a little puzzled by it. That's all.
All right, we can go over that. I see a question from Connell Fanning. How does intentionality build objectivity into the subjectivity of a consciousness. He refers us to page 46 near the top. So I'm going to look at that because I'm not sure I completely understand the question. This is in chapter 7. Reality in a world of appearances is first of all characterized by standing still and remaining the same long enough to become an object for acknowledgement and recognition by a subject. So the real is that which is an object for a subject. It's something that is apparent, and in so appearing, stay still so that we can sense it in some way. Husserl's basic and greatest discovery takes up in exhaustive detail the intentionality of all acts of consciousness. Okay, that is the fact that no subjective act is ever without an object. Though the scene tree may be an illusion, for the act of seeing it, it is an object nevertheless. Though the dreamt of landscape is visible only to the dreamer, it is the object of his dream. Objectivity is built into the very subjectivity of consciousness by virtue of intentionality. So the idea here is simply that if you're a subject and you perceive, then you perceive as an object. So it's impossible to be a subject without an object, and it's impossible to have an object without a subject. These are just basic, correlative ideas. So Connell asks, how does the intentionality build objectivity into the subjectivity? Well, it's simply the case that if I'm a subject, remember, Connell, what a subject means is subjectum, right? Subjectum, which means eject. Jectum means to throw, and sub means under. The subject is that which is thrown under. It's what is undergirding perception. The object is that which is thrown against. It's that which the subject is thrown against the subject and is seen or perceived by the subject. So the point is that in any subject, in any perception, there's an intent which requires there to be something perceived, thrown against it. Why is this important? For Arendt, the reason she goes into this little digression, I think, on Husserl, is that it helps her to say what she wants to say, which is that the apparent world, as a world of appearances and thus objects, require a subject, so that every appearing object has its intentional subject, and thus every appearance is a conveyance for receivers, or we can say spectators. What this means is that in a world of objects and appearing things, there must be spectators. And that's what Arendt here wants us to understand, that appearance demands spectators. And thus the idea of a solipsistic thinking ego that exists without anyone else and anything else and just is a pure thought is a fallacy. It's a fantasy. It doesn't exist. That's the point she's trying to make. It's an experiential feeling we have. All of us have at some point in our lives the feeling of ourselves as a pure thinking being, separate from the world, withdrawn from the world. But it's a fantasy. That's what she's trying to say, Connell. Is that helpful? Is that clear? I don't know if Connell's hearing.
Thank you very much. I think I was misunderstanding the word objectivity. The emphasis is on object. I was thinking in terms of impartial or things like that.
Right. No, here she's not talking about that. She's talking about the object. In German, the word would be Gegenstand or Gegenstandlichkeit. It's that thing that stands against me. It's used in a very literal sense. Objektum, that which is thrown against me. In German, we write Gegenstand, that which stands against me. And what objectivity is, in the sense that you're talking about it, is the scientific idea that I, as a subject, can know the verifiable truth of those things that stand against me, and I can either, what I can say about them can either be true or false. That's a scientific hypothesis, but that's not per se what she's talking about in this particular passage. Nancy asks, I'm perplexed by the ontological status of common sense, or the sixth sense. So that's a good question, Nancy. We haven't gotten to chapter 8 yet, or I mean, we're reading it today. I haven't spent much time on it. And we're going to do it in a little bit. So I'm going to hold that question off until we get to chapter 8. And just let me see if there's any, it looks like that's where people are headed. So I'm going to go to chapter 8. Why not? And we'll begin to answer Nancy's question about the ontological status of common sense. So chapter 8 is called Science and Common Sense, Kant's distinction between intellect and reason, truth and meaning. So just to remind ourselves of the arc, the overarching question of the book is what is the activity of thinking? And she wants to argue that the activity of thinking is not about the pursuit of truth, but is about the pursuit of meaning. It's thus not about cognition or the intellect. It's about the reasonable pursuit of meaning. So at the end of chapter 7, she's talking about this feeling of thinking and this feeling of reality. And she says, thinking cannot destroy the feeling of reality, but it can suspend it. So we all have a sense of thinking. We also have a sense of that we live in a real world. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like this book is real, and the table I'm sitting at is real, and thank God the chair I'm sitting on is real, or I would be falling. And there's this feeling that I live in a real world. And as much as Descartes says that we are thinking beings and we are rational beings, and that there's a separation of my thinking and my body, what Arendt says is we all have this feeling of being placed in reality. And the common sense is the sixth sense that sort of is responsible for uniting all of our other five senses and giving us this feeling of reality. Thinking can destroy that feeling. I mean, cannot destroy that feeling, she says, but it can suspend it temporarily. The great story that all philosophers tell about this, including Arendt, I should say there's a great book by Jacques Tominot, who just died last month, one of the great philosophers of our time and one of the great readers of Hannah Arendt. We have a nice eulogy we put up on our website about a month ago if you're interested. But Jacques Tominot wrote a book on Hannah Arendt on the question of the Thracian maid. And the Thracian maid is the story told of a Thracian maid in Thrace, back in Greece, who's walking along and sees, who is it? One of the Greek philosophers known for his great speculative thought. I'm blanking on his name. But she sees him walking along, and he's thinking about the stars, and he falls into a well. And she goes to him and says, you're so brilliant and you're so thoughtful, but you can't even see what's in front of you, whereas I'm just a maid, but I don't fall into wells. And this idea of this image of the philosopher who is so caught up in his mind and in his thought that he doesn't see what the world in front of him is this idea that Thales is the philosopher, and he's so caught up in the world of ideas that he doesn't see the world in front of him. And Arendt says you can't destroy the world, but someone like Thales can suspend it and withdraw from reality. And all thinkers do this, but true philosophers do it more than the rest of us. And so she starts chapter 8 and says, we see something very similar with science and the modern scientist. The end of science, she says, is a decision about what is worthwhile knowing. And a scientist wants to know, they want to know the truth. They want to know what is. And to a certain degree, you have to separate yourself from common sense in order to go behind common sense. And yet, even though that's the case, even though there's a way in which science, like philosophy, removes ourselves from the common sense world, science in the end wants to know the truth, and it seeks cognition. And that cognition is based on evidence, and that evidence is taken from the world of appearances. And those appearances can reveal what's true, but they can also conceal what's true. And every disillusion, and thus every new scientific truth, is a loss of one earlier truth and one earlier piece of evidence. But it's the acquisition of a new one. She cites Merleau-Ponty for this idea on page 54. There is in science, on the one hand, a rejection of common sense, and on the other hand, an affirmation of common sense and an attempt to rethink common sense and bring about a new common sense. So Nancy, your question, just to go back to it, is, I'm perplexed by the ontological status of common sense, or this sixth sense. Well, common sense is this, it's not one of the five senses, right? Sight, sound, touch, smell. I'm going to miss one. Sight, sound, touch, smell. What else do we do? Hearing.
We hear you. We hear you.
Yeah.
We hear you.
Yeah. So it's not one of the five physical senses, but it's this non-physical sense that fits all those senses together and gives us our sense of reality. It's not like pure thought, because pure thought is a withdrawal from the world. It's not at all like that. It's in the world, and yet it's not a physical sense. So the being, the ontology of common sense is what she calls the feeling of reality. That's another way to put it. Okay, Nancy? Or questions about that?
Yeah, let me see if I can do the sound. Can you hear me?
I do, yes.
Okay. I wondered if it's kind of something that's inferred and reconstructed or extrapolated, or if it's I just wondered how much power she's giving to it. That's why I used the word ontological. I just find that a little confusing. It would help me if brain research today could be tied to, if it's some kind of executive function or integrative function or something.
Right.
I'm
not sure how the brain scientist will deal with it. She calls it a mysterious sixth sense. I see, touch, taste, smell, and hear. But there's one faculty that extends to all objects of the five senses, this mysterious sixth sense, because it cannot be localized as a bodily organ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? It doesn't
Exactly.
have a bodily organ. It doesn't have a physical sense to it. It fits the sensations of my strictly private five senses, so private that sensations in their mere sensational quality and intensity are incommunicable. This is a point she makes and has been made a lot of some modern thinkers like Elaine Scarry. But our senses are things we can't actually communicate. They're so deeply wound into our sensational nature, our sensing nature, that we can't put them in words in a viable way. But somehow these five senses that we can't articulate each one come together to create a world, a reality that we feel. And that's what she calls this common sense that does this.
Is it like the Yiddish seichel? No.
Yeah, I mean, it's the people, if you either have it or you don't.
But it's hard to understand how it's separate from thought in the sense that, I mean, it's sort of like she's saying it's a gut reaction, not a cognitive reaction.
It's not just that it's a gut reaction but it's an engagement with the real world. Now, what she's trying to say about thought is that thought is a withdrawal from the world, the real world. Now, you can push back on this idea of thought, and in many ways she is going to do that. It's the idea of thought that begins with Plato and has its heyday in Descartes, and it's an idea that says that when I think, I don't have a place in the world. I'm atopos. The word utopia, our word utopia is the Greek atopo, which means without a place, no place. And Plato says that you can't do philosophy unless you study mathematics, right? No, only those who know arithmetic may enter here, he says. And the reason is that philosophy, in his mind, is thinking about the supersensible world, and the training to move beyond the sensible world comes from abstract thinking, mathematics. Mathematics is the model.
Yeah.
And so the common sense is not an abstract mathematical sense. It's a feeling of how those five physical senses integrate me into an apparent world. In a world of appearances, she says, that are always filled with error and semblance, reality is guaranteed by this threefold commonness. Right? So there's threefold commonness. I wrote. And these three things that she talks about are, one, the five senses, which are utterly different from each other, but have the same object in common. So I have five senses, and they all see you on the computer. I hear you, I see you, I can't really touch you, but I can touch the computer. And in some way, common sense unites those five senses into a sensible idea, a real idea. Then there's also the fact that members of the same species have the context in common that endows every single object with its particular meaning. So we all, as humans, see another human and we have a context. What sense is that? He called that common sense. That's one of the three ways in which common sense works. And the third way is that all other sense-endowed beings, namely animals or dogs, have a different perspective on what a human is. We don't really know what the dog's perspective on what a human is, we don't think. Maybe we do, I don't know. But it's different from ours. But we still agree that there's a thing called a human, or there's a thing there. And she says these are this is the way, these three different ways common sense fits us into a real world. And that this reality, and this is the point, is not the same as what happens in a thinking ego. And the thinking ego, while it couldn't exist outside of a reality, it thinks itself as withdrawn from it. And that's a fallacy, and yet it's an authentic fallacy. It's a fallacy that all thinking beings experience and can make sense of. That's the claim. So no, common sense is not thinking.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Nancy.
I just wanted to say that I'm beginning to see that she seems to put a lot of weight into common. And when we hear common sense, it's such a cliche that I'm now seeing that her whole idea of shared is really powerfully in the common part of common sense.
That is absolutely correct. The Latin is sensus communis, and that's the term that Kant will use. In German, it's Gemeinsinn. It's the sense that we hold together. And the common sense is that which brings us together in a world we share. And that is why she will say that Kant's reflections on common sense in the third critique, the critique of judgment, even though he never says it, are at the absolute center of his political thinking. Because without a common sense, you can't have a politics. You can't have a group of people who are pluralistic and thus unique and different, who nevertheless share something in common that makes them a unity, a people. And politics, for Arendt, is through action and speech, through talking and acting together with each other, is from the bottom up, not the top down, from the bottom up articulation and discovery of what it is we share in common. And in talking to each other, we realize that we share certain things in common, certain ways of seeing the world, certain objects. And in doing so, we begin to lay the groundwork for being a political community. The word politics, right? Our word politics comes from the Greek polis, right? The Greek polis, which is the city-state. And the Greek word for a politician is a politikon. Well, the word polis and politikon itself in Greek comes from a Greek verb, pelein, which describes the shape of the smoke rings that come up from a peace pipe, that go in a circular, concentric circles. And you might think, what the hell does politics have to do with the concentric circles of a peace pipe? Well, a politician is the one who speaks the truth of a people and stands in the center. And the people who hear the politician speak or see that politician act and gather around that politician form the polis. So the polis exists wherever people speak and act together. The polis exists wherever there is someone or some group of people who speak in a way that make visible the common. And so yes, this common aspect of the common sense and the sensus communis is at the absolute core of what she's interested in and after. Okay? I hope that's helpful. Someone else had tried to jump in with a question. Do you still have it? Yeah?
Yeah. So I want to ask about science. You're referring to science. I'm a little confused because Arendt said that, or you said that thinking is, how should I say this? Thinking is not about truth, it's about meaning. But then you said that science.
Yeah, okay, yes, go ahead.
I thought that's what you said.
Yes, you're right. I'm sorry, yes.
And that science, but science, you said, is about uncovering truths. I don't agree with that, but you said that. And that would mean that science is not thinking in the terms you're talking about. But
That's exactly right, Mark. And that's what she says, by the way. So now what's the question?
No, I was asking you about that. Was that a contradiction or not?
No, I mean, what she says is that the end of science is a decision about what is worthwhile knowing. Okay? And what science wants to know is what is true, right? Science looks at the sun rising. I mean, to just use the easy example, and says, is it true that the sun rises? And it says, no, it's not. The sun actually is in the center, and the earth revolves around the sun, and there's an illusion that it arises. The science, science looks at the book and says, is that well, what is that? And science says, well, actually, it's, ink created from whatever with mushed paper from trees, and it has molecules and atoms in it. And, while, you see the book and the book is there, there's a deeper truth behind it. And so science, she says, doesn't rest satisfied with common sense. It needs to constantly seek to disillusion ourselves and find new truths, which then we will seek to disillusion ourselves from, and will be new truths, which we will then seek to disillusion ourselves. And so science is a disillusioning machine, to sort of paraphrase Max Weber. And it seeks constantly to show us that the world as we think we understand it is not true, and that there's a deeper truth. And she says that decision that science makes, that what's worthwhile about knowing is the truth, is not itself a scientific decision. That's a decision that that has no scientific answer. You can't prove that science is more true than religion. You can prefer scientific explanations to it, but you can't prove it. It's not a scientific decision to seek the truth rather than the truth of science rather than the truth of mythology. So
Deutsch says that science is an attempt to come to the best possible unique explanation for events. And in that sense, science is a way of expanding the senses. And the disillusionment, I think, comes rather not from discounting our senses, but rather from discounting mythologies. We're disillusioned because there's the notion of God or an all-powerful creature is, that's diminished quite a bit.
So I would say that Deutsch needs to change one word in his sentence that you quoted me, and I haven't read Deutsch, so I'm going to rely on you. And that word would be best, right? I think what Arendt would say, if I understand her correctly, is science is the most powerful. What was the rest of the sentence you gave us? But a way of understanding the world, or whatever it was. It's the most efficacious. It's certainly the most objective. All of these things are true, but what makes it the best? That's not a question science can answer, right? That's a question that, no scientist can actually make a scientific claim that it's the best. That's a moral, meaningful question. And that's a question that she would associate with thinking, not with knowing. Does that I mean, you don't have to agree with her, I guess. I mean, obviously
I'm
not.
just,
But does it make sense, this distinction she's making?
yes, it's very old-fashioned. Yes, it makes sense.
Okay. It's old-fashioned. What does that mean?
It means that the modern views of science are quite different than the way what you're describing. Modern views of science don't seek truth. They seek uncovering of layers. They seek an expansion of common sense or a model that's in our heads. Modern science talks about those models, the PSM, the phenomenological self-model, as what you're referring to as common sense. And so there's a whole different way of looking at things now.
Yeah, I don't think that's at odds with the way she's seeing science. So if you look on page
This is the exact same thing you just
55, right?
uncovering things to.
On page 55, she says near the bottom, one consequence, however, of this development seems to me obvious and of considerable importance. This is the development we've largely been talking about. The very notion of truth, which somehow had survived so many turning points of our intellectual history, underwent a decisive change. It was transformed, or rather broken down, into a string of verities, each one in its time claiming general validity, even though the very continuity of the research implied something merely provisional. That's exactly what, Mark, you just said, right? She understands science exactly as you just said it. It's a series of hypotheses and models and a string of verities, each one claiming validity, even though the continuity of research implies something merely provisional. This is a strange state of affairs. It may even suggest that if a given science accidentally reached its goal, namely to find truth, to find some unlimited progress, this would by no means stop the workers in the field, who would be driven past their goal by the sheer momentum of the illusion of unlimited progress, a kind of semblance rising out of their activity. So what she's saying here is there's actually a dualism, a paradox at the heart of science. On the one hand, science is driven by a conviction that there is some truth, some ultimate truth that we can reach. Otherwise, why bother constantly overcoming and destroying what we know to get to the next one? And yet, science also knows that it will never get to that ultimate truth, and that it is simply a string of verities, so that truth becomes a constantly provisional model or verity. And she says the transformation of truth into mere verity results primarily from the fact that the scientist remains bound to the common sense by which we find our bearings in the world of appearances. So, I think that's exactly the model you just described that she is sharing. All she's saying is that insofar as science is bound to common sense, and insofar as it's bound to verities, and insofar as it's bound to model after model of a string of verities that seeks to have more efficacious, more objective, and more scientifically explanatory understandings of the world, it's not thinking. Because thinking is something different. Thinking is, as she says in a couple sentences down, it lacks the safeguards of common sense because it has no connection to reality. It's speculative and seeks unlimited progress, whereas science is caught up in the finite. Thinking has a prejudice for the infinite. And that science, as a decision for the finite and for the common sense, that's not a scientific decision. That's a prejudice of sorts. It's common sense prejudice that connects science to the real world. So I'm not sure, Mark, I mean, I think I hear what you're saying, and I think she understands science exactly in the sense you mean it. What she then wants to say about it, though, is that science seeks to apprehend perceptions. This is going to be on page 57. I'm going to make a list here. So science is going to do a couple things. It's going to apprehend perceptions. It's going to grasp what is given to the senses. It's going to use truth as a criteria. And it's going to find truth as a criteria from the world of appearances and the evidence of our senses. It's going to seek to see and know the world as it's given to the senses. And it's going to do this in a string of verities that constantly seek to dispel error and illusion to create new verities. All that is how she understands science. And she says that's different from thinking. Thinking is not about apprehending or perceiving, it's about conceiving. Therefore, it's not about understanding what is given by the senses, it's about understanding meaning, which is nonsensible. It's not about truth, it's about meaning. It's not about the evidence of the senses, it's about what it means to be. And so what she's saying is if we're actually interested in thinking as an activity, we're not actually interested in science. We're interested in this other thing. And one can say, well, science is much more important than thinking. And clearly, in some sense, that's right. I mean, science is a lot more efficacious. It's a lot more important in our lives than thinking. And yet, this book is asking the question of, what is thinking different from science, and does it matter? And to go back to the introduction, right? Page 1 of the book. And what she says in the introduction is, thinking generally doesn't matter. But maybe there's a way in which it does, and maybe thinking, this is again based in her reading of Eichmann, matters because thinking makes us stop and think and takes us out of the world, takes us out of what everyone else says, takes us out of common sense. And in doing so, allows us to be critical, allows us to destroy common sense in a way that we ask hard questions, and maybe thinking, she says, is the one thing that can prevent evil in the world. Most of the time, 99.9% of the time, thinking is useless. It has no purpose. But maybe if you're habituated into the activity of thinking, this useless activity of thinking about meaning and not about truth, maybe if you're habituated into this, there will be times when thinking is absolutely essential to prevent evil and restore an ethical balance to the world. So let me ask Mark, I mean, whether or not we agree with everything she says, I mean, is it the distinction between science and thinking that you challenge, if I'm understanding you correctly?
Yes. The science has the essential part of science is theorizing. It isn't deducing from the senses or from things we know. And theorizing has to do with imagination and coming up with things that counter common sense. It's precisely what you described for thinking, except that there is a focus on explaining things. But the theories, the process of doing scientific thinking is about imagination and coming up with wild ideas, most of which don't work and are useless. The testing of those ideas is deduction, and that's something entirely different.
I think that's true, and she'll say that in an interesting way. I think it's on page 62. Let me just see if this is, I think this is where she says it. So on 61 to 62, the last line of 61 I'll start with. She says, by drawing a distinguishing line between truth and meaning, right? This is the line that she's drawing and that Mark's questioning, which is totally fine. By drawing a distinguishing line between truth and meaning, between knowing and thinking, right? This is the line. And by insisting on its importance, I do not wish to deny that thinking's quest for meaning and knowledge's quest for truth are connected. So this is exactly what you just said, Mark. She doesn't deny that in science, which she would call knowledge, there's also thinking. And she's not going to deny that in thinking, there's also knowledge, right? They're connected. By posing the unanswerable questions of meaning, men establish themselves as question-asking beings. So insofar as we think in Arendt's terms, we ask questions, and thus we seek answers. And on the other hand, behind all the cognitive questions, so this is what she means by science, for which men find answers, there lurk the unanswerable ones that seem entirely idle and have always been denounced as such. It is more likely that men, if they were ever to lose the appetite for meaning we call thinking and cease to ask unanswerable questions, would lose not only the ability to produce those thought things that we call works of art, but also the capacity to ask all the answerable questions upon which civilization is founded. So there's no sense in which these are unconnected. And there's also a sense in which, of course, thinking is useful for science. You can't do science without thinking, without having imagination, as you rightly said. And she actually says that more directly on page 61, the page before, where she's talking about Hegel. Right? She says Hegel, in the Middle Ages, philosophy was seen as the handmaiden of theology. Namely, thinking was seen as in the service of theology. Hegel changes that and makes thinking in the service of science, the science of knowledge. What she wants to say is that to see thinking simply as a handmaiden of anything is to deny thinking its rightful place in as an independent activity of the human being. Now, you could say, I don't think there is such a thing as thinking absent science or absent cognition or absent some end. And that's actually a question she ends this chapter with. Let me just say that. She says Kant himself was confused about this, right? She says that on the one hand, Kant says that that thinking is purposive, and he says what undermined Kant's greatest discovery, the distinction between knowledge, which uses thinking as a means to an end, and thinking itself as it arises. This is on page 64. So what undermines Kant's distinction between knowledge and thinking was that he constantly compared the two with each other. And only if truth and not meaning is the ultimate criterion of men's mental activities does it make sense in this context to speak of deception and illusion at all. So there's a way in which Kant ignored the very distinction he makes between thinking and meaning. Between thinking and knowing. And like Mark, says they're both the same. But Arendt ends this chapter with this line of Kant's when she says pure reason, it's the last line of the chapter, is in fact occupied with nothing but itself. It can have no other vocation. And she says this is a contradiction that goes right through Kant's work, all of it. On the one hand, thinking he sometimes moves into knowing and is part of knowing and is purposive. And on the other hand, he says pure reason thinking has no vocation other than just pure thinking. And so she's picking up on that contradiction and trying to say, all right, is there something we can say about thinking itself, not thinking for science, not thinking for some other end? That's the question she's posing for herself. Let Let me just take a couple of these other questions and we can come back to this, because I see there's a lot now. Ken writes, I think she says that common sense always needs to be backed by facts eventually. Yeah, I mean, common sense fits us into the real world. And so, and this is one of the things she says about science. I mean, Mark is absolutely right. Science requires theorizing. It requires thinking. You can't do science without imagination. And I mean, she makes this distinction that she makes somewhere in this section between scientists and plumbers, right? Or technologists and scientists. And technologists are mere plumbers. But scientists think. They're creative. And thus they need to think and get outside of facts. But they're always limited. They're called back by common sense. Because in the end, what science is interested in is truth. That's the claim she's making. And because science is interested in truth, it makes a decision about what is worthwhile. This is the line I keep coming back to. It's on page 54. The end of science is a decision about what is worthwhile knowing. And while Mark is right, and as Arendt herself says, in science you have to theorize and you have to imagine and you have to take chances. In the end, science comes back to what is worthwhile knowing. And thus it comes back to facts and common sense. And that's part of what's going to separate it from thinking, which is unlimited and not hemmed in by common sense. Bob writes, how does Arendt's concept of appearance square with Darwin's theory of natural selection? It would seem that for Darwin, life or being, is trying out a role in appearance. But for Arendt, appearance is independent of consequences. Or is it? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by independent of consequences. I mean, her claim here in this book is that appearance has consequences, right? I mean, it's not the feathers are not just a pretty covering, and they're not just to lead to sexual reproduction, through attraction or whatever. Appearance matters for her, and it impacts the world. So I'm not sure, Bob, what you mean by opposed to consequences, or independent of consequences. The square with Darwin's theory of natural selection. I have to think about that. So I'm trying to understand exactly what you're saying. So Darwin says that mutations happen, and some of them are visible and apparent, and some of them are more invisible, and the fittest survive, and there's a natural selection of the fittest. How does that fit with? I'm not sure I understand the question, Bob, I have to admit, so maybe you can expand it.
Well, it seems to me that appearance is its own coming into. It's almost like something Aristotelian. It's coming into its idea of itself. Whereas in natural selection, maybe it doesn't challenge that, but there is a competition amongst appearances. And in Darwin, there is a suggestion that mutation, or what have you, is a response to that competition.
So I'd say a few things. One is that in Darwin, natural selection can be about surface appearances, but also about hidden internal organs and things. So it's not necessarily about appearance. But if we limit it to appearance, so that certain traits like the peacock's feathers or beauty or whatever it is has some sort of fitness and leads to some sort of advantage. That I think is true. I think there's, from a Darwinian perspective, it's true. I'm not sure how that fits exactly with Arendt's thinking about appearance. I mean, the claim about appearance begins with Portman, right? And that's that it's against the functionalist thesis that all things are simply have a function, and to the extent that something appears, it simply has some function that helps the body under it. Whereas Portman is saying that there's some desire to appear and be different and be plural that is part of a drive of all living beings, butterflies, Mediterranean sea snails, tulips, etc. And that what we see is when we don't take into account appearance and we focus only on function, we don't look at the incredible plurality and breadth of individual unique species and individuals within each species. And we simply say, well, all humans are, rational and want to live well and eat and reproduce. And what she says is, no, they want to be pretty, they want to develop, they want to put interesting tattoos and other things on them, they want to grow in different ways, and that there's an infinite plurality and variety, and to reduce them to functional rules is an affront to what it means to be an individual in human or even in other species. And that's the beginning of her interest in appearance. The second aspect of her interest in appearance is that once you value that incredible plurality and uniqueness that we see, and don't reduce it to a function, to functionalist explanations, then we see that this apparent world we live in is one that is deeply rich and full of common sense. But the question becomes, where is thinking in that world? What place does thinking, which doesn't appear, which is invisible, have in that apparent world? And that becomes the question that this whole first section, we've just read 70 pages, right? Is sort of, it's all negative in some way. It's saying thinking is this invisible thing that doesn't appear. Let's try and fully understand how unique thinking is in a world in which appearances are so important and appearances are so dominant. And then the second chapter, which we're going to start in 2 weeks, is called Mental Activities in a World of Appearances. Once we've seen the vast split and the discord between thinking and common sense, thinking and appearances, now we're going to start to ask, to what extent can we actually now begin to start to look for and find thinking as an invisible activity of withdrawing from the common world in that world? And if you look at some of the chapter titles, invisibility and withdrawal, so we're going to remind ourselves of what thinking is. Warfare between thought and common sense. That thought is so outside of common sense that it can be at war with common sense. Thinking and doing. And then language and metaphor is going to move us into a whole new realm where she's going to start to say that insofar as we think through language and thus through metaphor, our thinking is actually directed and impacted by the common sense world from which our metaphors come. And that they're not as separate maybe as might be we had thought. And maybe that's so obvious, you all know that. But then she's going to ask, well, how do we move from metaphor to the ineffable, metaphor to the invisible? And that's what the next chapter, Metaphor and the Ineffable, is, which is going to end that second section. So there's sort of a preview. Maybe I may just not understand the Darwin point. I'm not sure. Bob, you want to try one more time, or am I getting it or not?
I may not understand it either, so you're fine.
Okay, I'm sorry. I hope it makes sense. Jack tries to say something helpful. Let's see, Bob. It would appear that her references to Portman suggests that her own thinking is in some way counter-Darwinian. Okay. I'm going to leave Darwin from now. Arnold asks, would the neuro people say that the organ of the sixth sense is the brain, which encompasses the other five senses?
If I could just say, Roger, my reading of these people, the neuroscientists and all this, is that their goal is to bring it all down to physics, chemistry, and electrical impulses. So their metaphor or their idea might be that the sixth sense is actually a bodily organ, the central nervous system. I think that's the goal in this language, but
right.
That's just
so she'll talk about that at times, especially in I believe in her essay on the conquest of space. She'll talk about the difference between brain and mind, which is exactly this distinction that you're talking about, and make the case that the brain is an organ of the senses and of calculation and knowing, whereas the mind is what she'll call thinking. So I think you're right. I think there's a neurological thesis that will try and say that all thought is in the end cognitive. She's obviously not she's gonna disagree with that, and we'll have to see why as we keep reading the book. Jennifer writes, if our common sense unites us and gives us a feeling of reality, then what happens when we lose our common sense? Can that happen? Indeed. I mean, Jennifer, if you read a lot of Arendt, one of the lines that you'll come across over and over again is the end of common sense, the death of common sense. I mean, the crisis of modernity is, for Hannah Arendt, in many ways, the crisis of the death of common sense. It's the break in tradition. It's the loss of any common world that we share. And it has many sources. One is Cartesian doubt. One is simply relativism. Science, insofar as science is constantly questioning anything that's common. But in the end, a big part of it is a loss of the belief in immortality. Immortality is one of those words and ideas that Arendt writes a lot about and very few people pick up on because it's so foreign to us today. I'm actually just trying to finish a paper right now on immortality in Arendt, and it's one of those things that when you start looking, you find it in everything she writes. But she says that the fundamental distinction between the ancients and the moderns is that the ancients could look at certain things and say, those were great deeds, those were great words, that was a great person, and they deserve to be remembered. And thus there was a common sense about what those things are that we all think are meaningful and great. And that's part of what all ancient poetry and ancient writing and ancient thinking was about, was identifying what was worth immortalizing and holding on to and finding in common. And that in the modern age, we no longer believe in things that are great, things that deserve to be remembered. We think that it's all political, that's all about, there's oppression here and oppression there, and there's politics. There's no sense of a common insight into what is worth remembering and what holds us together. And that is the death of common sense. So yes, it can happen, and it largely has happened. And when common sense is lost, dies, that makes politics almost impossible, right? If the definition I gave of politics before is the unifying of a multitude around the rings, it requires somebody to say what is great and what is true and what is right and what is meaningful, and others to come around them and accept it and acknowledge it. Well, if we don't have that common sense, what holds the people together except living near each other and having it be useful, utilitarian grounds? We lose the fundamental transcendence that Arendt says is at the heart of all politics. So, the loss of common sense can happen and is dangerous. And you ask, do we become disconnected and polarized? Yes, that's exactly what happens. And that's why politics is such a hard activity in the modern age. The answer for Arendt is speaking and talking with one another and trying to articulate and develop a common sense. But that's hard. And it takes time and it takes courage. We have very little of that today. Is that all right, Jennifer? Because I'm running out of time, but if you want to add anything, I'm happy to have you add something.
That is that our polarization, since we're so polarized, and I've seen maps from the New York Times, red dots and blue dots of where we were in Congress in the 70s and how we've pulled apart and split. So we had a lot of purple in the middle in the 70s and 80s. By the 90s, we start shredding and pulling apart. Now there's like one little purple dot in the middle of red and blue. So this, in a sense, is where I think Trump pushed through. There's this gaping hole, and it can be filled by a reality TV show host. And this is the dangerous place we're in, that we can't decide of. And then even in the debate with Kamala Harris and Biden on the segregation issue, that is spilling out onto Twitter and Facebook today. And there's so many people defending the segregationist mentality, in a sense. That's a whole nother topic, but I see that lack of common sense. That I don't know. I don't know what else to say there, but it just rang true to me that I see us losing common sense. That binds us.
Yeah, no, I think that's very much part of the argument of a lot of her work. So one of the questions then is, what's the relation between thinking and common sense? This book is about thinking. And that will come back. Someone's sharing their screen, so if you could stop sharing your screen. Do we know who's sharing their screen? Samantha or Craig, can you figure out who's sharing? Whoever's sharing their screen, if you could stop, that would be great. The loss of common sense requires us to ask, how can we potentially restore common sense? And one answer is going to be through thinking, through making thinking a habit again. Because when people actually think, they interrupt common sense, and they potentially offer the potential for a new common sense to emerge. But that's going to be another 100 pages into the book, and I hope we'll get there soon. We will. Robert McDermott writes, does the reference to Husserl at the bottom of 52 help? Husserl claimed that the suspension of this feeling was the methodological foundation of his phenomenological science. Help with what, Robert? Just so I know what the question is.
Well, I was just thinking that to the extent that Arendt is referring to Husserl, and his suspension of the sixth sense, which he then goes on to say is what the thinking ego does, and so forth. That perhaps someone more familiar with Husserl than I am could say what it was that Husserl meant by the sixth sense, which I guess a lot of us are struggling with.
Well, I mean, Husserl's basic idea is, as you all, I'm sure you know, is to the things themselves. So to avoid general concepts and philosophical concepts, and think the things themselves. So to the extent we say claim that the suspension of the feeling of reality was the foundation for his phenomenological science, that in order to think the things themselves, you have to, in a sense, get out of reality and then approach them from a thinking ego point of view. And then she continues, for the thinking ego, the suspension is a matter of course, and by no means a special method to be taught and learned. We know it as the quite ordinary phenomena of absent-mindedness, be observed in anyone who happens to be absorbed in no matter what sort of thought. In other words, the loss of common sense is neither the vice nor the virtue of Kant's professional thinker. It happens to everybody who ever reflects on something. We all can stand outside of common sense and outside of this feeling of reality. And the philosopher, like Husserl, needs to do so, but we all can. I think that's the point here. Okay. Ken writes, science is an extension of common sense using tools, perhaps. Exactly. I think that's exactly right. Nancy writes, is this notion of science on the bottom of 55 similar to Peirce's notion of the final interpretant? I'm going to pass on that simply because I don't know. I don't know Peirce well enough to answer that question, and we don't have enough time. I mean, the quest for a final interpretant drives interpretation, but it's never attainable for humans. I'm going to pass. We're out of time, and I actually have to leave in 15 minutes to go to Geneva. So I am apologizing. We're going to end now. If Sam, you want to continue or not, I don't know. But we're going to read for next week. We're going to start book 2, or in 2 weeks. And Samantha's going to lead the session. I'm going to try and be on it from Italy. And this was great. I hope you had a good time. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to run out
Bye-bye.
quickly because I got to go. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye. Have a good trip.